There are moments when heaven touches earth so gently that most people never notice. But for those who do, nothing is ever the same again. On January 14, 2024, in the snow-covered mountains near Flagstaff, Arizona, a 7-year-old boy knelt in a frozen backyard and began speaking to someone no one else could see. What happened next would shatter the boundaries between faith and science, expose the darkest corners of a broken system, and prove that some miracles arrive not with thunder, but with the whisper of a child who refused to stop believing. Subscribe now to receive daily miracles of Our Lady in your life. His name was Caleb Morrison, and when he stepped out of the social worker's sedan that bitter winter afternoon, he carried everything he owned in a torn purple backpack. 2 shirts, 1 pair of jeans, underwear 3 sizes too small, and a tarnished silver medal of Our Lady of the Snows tied with dirty string around his neck. 3 years, 11 foster homes, 14 different caseworkers, 1 small boy who had learned that love was temporary, that adults lied, and that the only thing you could trust in this world was that eventually, everyone would send you away. Mark Morrison watched from the porch of the timber frame house as his wife Susan signed the placement papers, her hands trembling slightly in the cold. He didn't want to be here. He hadn't wanted any of this. Not the home study visits, not the background checks, not the mandatory parenting classes for prospective adoptive parents, and especially not this. A damaged child with hollow eyes who would inevitably remind him every single day of the son he'd never gotten to hold. 5 years ago, Susan had delivered a stillborn baby boy at 23 weeks. They'd named him Daniel. Mark had built a small shrine in the backyard, a wooden shelter protecting a ceramic statue of the Virgin Mary, surrounded by river stones Susan had painted with prayers. He'd done it for her, not because he believed. Mark Morrison was a forest engineer, a man of measurements and meteorological data, someone who understood fire behavior models and defensible space protocols. He understood science. He did not understand grief, and he certainly didn't understand faith. "Come on, sweetheart," Susan said softly, reaching for Caleb's hand. The boy pulled away instinctively, clutching his backpack tighter. Susan's smile didn't falter, but Mark saw the flicker of pain cross her face. "Let's get you inside where it's warm." Caleb looked up at the house. 2 stories of pine and stone tucked against the mountainside, smoke rising from the chimney, icicles hanging like crystal teeth from the eaves. Behind the house, the San Francisco peaks rose white and imposing against a pewter sky. The child's expression remained unreadable. That first night, Caleb ate dinner in complete silence, methodically consuming his chicken and potatoes without looking up. When Susan showed him to his room, she'd spent weeks preparing it, painting the walls a soft blue, filling the shelves with books and toys. The boy simply nodded and closed the door. They heard him drag the dresser in front of it. "He's scared," Susan whispered that night in bed, her voice breaking. "He thinks we're going to send him back." Mark stared at the ceiling, his jaw tight. "We knew this wouldn't be easy." "I know, but Mark, when I looked in his eyes today, I saw Daniel. I know that sounds crazy, but Susan," his voice came out harsher than he intended. Please don't do that." She turned away from him, and he felt the familiar distance open between them like a chasm neither knew how to cross. The next morning, Mark found Caleb's door open and the boy gone. Panic seized his chest as he called out, running through the house. Susan bolted from the kitchen, flour on her hands from the pancakes she'd been making. They searched every room, the garage, the basement storage area. Nothing. Then Susan gasped, pointing through the kitchen window. Caleb knelt in the snow beside the shrine, his thin jacket inadequate against the 18-degree cold, his bare hands pressed together in prayer. The morning sun broke through the clouds just enough to illuminate him, a small silhouette against blinding white, perfectly still except for his lips moving soundlessly. Mark grabbed his coat and stormed outside. "Caleb, what are you doing? You'll freeze to death out here." The boy didn't respond, didn't even turn around. Mark reached him and grabbed his shoulder, spinning him around, and stopped cold. Caleb's face was streaked with tears, but his expression held something Mark had never seen in a 7-year-old. Absolute, unshakable peace. "She's talking to me," Caleb whispered. "Who's talking to you?" "The lady." Caleb pointed at the statue of Mary. "She says you're angry because you miss your baby. She says his name is Daniel, and he's with her now, and he's happy." The world tilted. Mark felt his pulse hammering in his ears. They'd never told Caleb about Daniel. The adoption agency had specifically advised against sharing that information too soon, to avoid overwhelming the child with their own grief. "Who told you that name?" Mark's voice came out strangled. "The lady. She tells me lots of things." Caleb looked down at his medal, touching it gently. "Sister Margaret gave me this before she died. She said the lady would always protect me, even when nobody else would. I didn't believe her for a long time. But then yesterday when we got here, I saw her standing right there." He pointed to the exact spot where the statue stood. She was real, not like the statue. She had light all around her, and she smiled at me, and she said I was finally home. Susan had come outside and stood frozen behind Mark, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. "Caleb," Mark said carefully, his engineer's mind desperately trying to find rational explanation. "Sometimes when we're in new places, our imagination—" "She said you would say that," Caleb interrupted, his voice matter-of-fact. "She said you're sad and angry and you don't believe in miracles anymore because you think God took your baby away. But she said that's not true. She said Daniel didn't get taken away. He came straight to her, and she's been taking care of him until you can meet him in heaven someday." Mark's knees buckled. He sat down hard in the snow, staring at this impossible child who spoke impossible truths with the casual certainty of someone reporting the weather. "She said something else too," Caleb continued, kneeling back down and returning his gaze to the statue. "She said the big fire is coming, soon, and everyone's going to have to leave, but she said if we stay, if we trust her, our house will be protected. She promised." "What fire?" Susan whispered. Caleb shrugged. "I don't know. She just said the big fire. She showed me the mountain covered in red and black, but our house was like an island with green all around it." He looked back at Mark with those ancient, sorrowful eyes. "Are you going to send me back now? Because I know things I'm not supposed to know." Something cracked in Mark's chest. Not quite belief, but the first fracture in the wall he'd built around his heart. "No, Caleb," Susan said, rushing forward and kneeling beside him, pulling off her own coat to wrap around his shaking shoulders. "No, sweetheart. We're never sending you back. You're home now. You're our son." "Forever?" The word came out so small, so fragile. "Forever," she promised. That night, Mark sat in his office surrounded by his Forest Service maps and fire behavior charts, trying to make sense of what Caleb had said. It was January. Fire season in northern Arizona typically ran April through July. They'd had record snowfall this year, over 80 inches in the high country. The moisture levels made wildfire virtually impossible. The kid was traumatized, probably mixing up memories from news reports he'd seen in previous foster homes. That had to be it. But he couldn't shake the image of Caleb's face, that impossible peace, those tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than childhood fear. And he couldn't explain how the boy knew Daniel's name. Over the next 2 weeks, a pattern emerged. Every morning before dawn, Caleb would slip outside to the shrine. Sometimes he knelt in silence. Sometimes Mark could hear him whispering, having what sounded like a conversation with pauses for listening to responses no one else could hear. The boy never seemed to feel the cold, even when the temperature dropped to single digits. Susan began joining him, bringing hot chocolate and blankets, sitting quietly nearby while Caleb communed with whoever he believed was speaking to him. She didn't question it. For the first time since Daniel's death, Mark saw something return to his wife's face that he'd thought was lost forever: hope. But Mark remained skeptical. He watched from the window, documenting the behavior, trying to find patterns that might indicate delusion or suggestion. He contacted Dr. Raymond Vickers, a child psychologist in Flagstaff who specialized in trauma. Dr. Vickers agreed to visit informally. The psychologist spent 3 hours with Caleb on a Saturday afternoon. When he emerged from the session, his expression was troubled. "Mr. Morrison, your son is one of the most psychologically resilient children I've ever evaluated. His attachment responses are remarkably healthy given his history. He shows no signs of psychosis, dissociative disorder, or trauma-induced hallucination. Cognitively, he's exceptionally bright, reading at a 5th grade level, remarkable spatial reasoning, empathy scores off the charts." "But," Mark pressed. Dr. Vickers hesitated. "But he absolutely believes he's communicating with the Virgin Mary, not in a vague, childish way. He describes detailed conversations, claims she shows him things, future events, information he couldn't possibly know. I asked him about your deceased son, trying to determine if he'd overheard you and your wife discussing it. Mark, he described Daniel in detail, how far along the pregnancy was, that you'd already chosen the name, that Susan sang Amazing Grace to her belly every night. Things," he paused significantly, "that I confirmed with your wife he had no earthly way of knowing." Mark's stomach turned to ice. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can't explain it. I'm saying either this child has some form of extraordinary intuitive ability we don't have clinical framework for, or..." Dr. Vickers trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Or something genuinely anomalous is happening." "You're a man of science," Mark said desperately. "You can't actually be suggesting..." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what I observed. Caleb isn't mentally ill. He isn't making things up for attention. In fact, he seems almost reluctant to discuss his experiences. He's not trying to manipulate you or your wife. He simply reports with calm conviction that the Virgin Mary speaks to him daily, and somehow, he knows things he shouldn't know." That night, Mark lay awake beside Susan, listening to the wind howl through the pines. Doubt and wonder warred in his mind. He'd spent his entire adult life in the rational world of forestry science, where every phenomenon had a measurable cause. Fire spread based on fuel load, wind speed, humidity, and topography. Trees grew according to soil composition and sun exposure. There were formulas, predictive models, quantifiable data. There were no miracles. There was only what you could prove. But then why did his chest ache when he remembered Caleb saying Daniel's name? Why did he dream that night of his stillborn son, perfect and tiny, cradled in luminous arms while a voice like music whispered, "He is not lost, he was never lost, I held him then. I hold you now"? On February 7th, Caleb came inside from his morning prayers with an urgency Mark had never seen before. "It's today," the boy said, his voice tight with certainty. "The big fire. It starts today." Mark checked his phone. Temperature, 34 degrees. Humidity, 72%. Wind, calm. 6 inches of fresh snow had fallen overnight. The fire danger rating for Coconino County, low. "Caleb, buddy, there's not going to be any fire. Look outside. Everything's covered in snow." "I know what I see," Caleb said quietly. "She showed me again this morning. She said by tonight, the whole mountain will be burning. She said we have to choose. Leave like everyone else will or stay and trust her promise. She said this is when you'll have to decide if you believe." Mark felt frustration rising. "Caleb, I appreciate that you're trying to..." The phone rang. Mark grabbed it without looking at the caller ID. "Mark, it's Jenkins." Deputy Fire Chief Thomas Jenkins, Mark's contact at Flagstaff Fire Department. "Listen, we've got a situation developing. There was a vehicle accident this morning on Forest Road 231. Truck went off the highway, ruptured fuel tank, ignited dry grass under a stand of drought-stressed pines. The snow didn't reach that southern exposure area. Wind just shifted, kicking up to sustain 25 miles per hour with gusts to 40. Relative humidity dropping fast. Market spotting ahead of the main fire. Multiple ignitions. We're calling in air support, but with these winds..." His voice was grim. "I'm calling to tell you evacuation orders will be going out within the hour for your area. You need to get your family out. Now." Mark's blood turned to ice water. He looked at Caleb, who stood in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was somehow both terrified and certain. "How fast is it moving?" Mark asked, his voice hollow. "Faster than anything I've seen in 20 years. Mark, this thing is exhibiting extreme fire behavior. 100-foot flame lengths, crowning through the canopy, quarter-mile spot fires. Temperature inversion lifted, and now we've got perfect alignment of wind, slope, and fuel. If you're not out in 30 minutes, you might not get out at all." Mark hung up and looked at his wife, at his son, at the life they'd just barely begun to build together. "Pack emergency bags," he said mechanically. "We're evacuating. Now." "No." Caleb's voice was small but absolute. "She said we have to stay." "Caleb, there's a wildfire." "I know. She showed me. She said it's going to come right up to our house all around us, but it won't touch us. She said this is the sign you need. She said you have to choose to trust her." Mark wanted to scream. Instead, he grabbed Caleb's shoulders, perhaps too tightly. "Listen to me. Wildfires kill people. Real fires, not visions. I have spent my entire career studying how these things move, and I'm telling you that if we stay, we die. Do you understand?" Caleb's eyes filled with tears, but his voice remained steady. "I understand you're scared, but she promised. She said you would be scared, and she said that's okay. But she needs you to believe. Just this once." Susan put her hand on Mark's arm. "What if he's right? Susan, what if everything else he's known has been right? Daniel's name, the details about the pregnancy, things Dr. Vickers confirmed he couldn't possibly know. What if this is exactly what it seems like?" "What it seems like is insanity," Mark shouted. "You want me to risk our lives, risk our son's life on the word of a 7-year-old who thinks he talks to the Virgin Mary?" "She does talk to me," Caleb said softly. "And she's not asking you to risk my life. She's asking you to save yours." A massive boom echoed across the mountains, propane tanks exploding at a neighbor's property half a mile away. Through the window, Mark could see the first fingers of smoke rising above the tree line, black and venomous against the blue sky. His phone erupted with emergency alerts. Evacuation mandatory. Leave immediately. Fire approaching rapidly. "We have to go," Mark said, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I'm sorry, Susan. But I can't. I can't bet our lives on faith." He grabbed the emergency bags he kept packed in the garage, threw them in the truck, and stood at the door waiting for his family to follow. Susan looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the shrine visible through the kitchen window. "Our Lady of the Snows," the boy whispered, touching his medal. "You promised." And in that moment, as ash began to fall like gray snow and the smell of burning pine filled the air, a choice hung in the balance that would determine not just whether they lived or died, but whether Mark Morrison would finally stop running from the one truth he'd been afraid to face since the day they buried a son he never got to know. That some things cannot be measured. Some things cannot be explained. Some things can only be received by bowing your head, opening your heart, and whispering the most terrifying words in any language. "I believe." The fire came like a judgment from the Old Testament, swift, merciless, and absolutely unstoppable. By noon on February 7th, the Creek Fire, as it would later be named, had consumed over 4,000 acres of ponderosa pine forest. By 3 in the afternoon, it had jumped Highway 180, cut off 2 evacuation routes, and forced 300 families from their homes. By nightfall, it would become the fastest-moving winter wildfire in Arizona history, a meteorological impossibility that would baffle scientists and rewrite every predictive model the Forest Service had ever developed. And the Morrison family stood in their driveway watching it come. Mark had made his choice. Against every instinct, against every shred of training and rational thought, he'd put down the truck keys, walked back into the house, and said the words that felt like surrendering his soul. "We're staying." Susan had wept. Caleb had simply nodded, returned to the backyard shrine, and knelt in prayer. Now as the sky turned the color of a fresh bruise and ash fell thick as snowflakes, Mark Morrison understood with crystalline certainty that he'd just condemned his family to death. The temperature had spiked to 68 degrees despite the late afternoon hour. The wind howled down from the peaks in rotating gusts that bent the pines like grass. Every few minutes, his radio crackled with updates from the incident command post. Structure loss confirmed on Snowflake Lane. Multiple structures threatened on Timberline Drive. Firefighter safety compromised, pulling crews back to defensible positions. Their property sat on 12 acres of mixed conifer forest, surrounded by fuel loads that Mark himself had assessed just last autumn. 20 tons per acre of fine dead material, ladder fuels connecting ground cover to crown canopy, drought-stressed trees with moisture content below critical thresholds. In technical terms, their home occupied the center of what fire behavior analysts called a fuel jackpot, the kind of place that didn't just burn, it exploded. "I've made a terrible mistake," Mark whispered, standing at the living room window. "God forgive me, what have I done?" Susan came up beside him, slipping her hand into his. Her palm was ice cold despite the rising heat. "He's still out there. He won't come inside." Through the window, they could see Caleb's small form kneeling before the shrine, his hands folded, his lips moving in constant prayer. The boy had been there for 6 hours now, refusing food, refusing water, speaking to someone they couldn't see with an intensity that was both beautiful and terrifying. "I'm going to get him," Mark said, starting toward the door. "Wait." Susan gripped his arm. "Look." At first, Mark thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, a mirage born of smoke and fear and the shimmering heat waves that had begun to distort the air. But then he saw it clearly. A figure standing beside Caleb, translucent as morning mist, radiating soft light despite the darkening sky. A woman in flowing robes of blue and white, her hand resting gently on the boy's head. Mark's knees buckled. He grabbed the window frame for support, his breath coming in sharp gasps. "Susan, Susan, do you see?" "I see her," his wife breathed, tears streaming down her face. "Holy Mary, Mother of God, I see her." The vision lasted perhaps 10 seconds before fading like morning fog under sun. But in those 10 seconds, Mark Morrison's entire understanding of reality fractured and reformed into something he had no words to describe. The radio crackled with a new urgency. "All units be advised, fire has crested Morrison Ridge. Multiple spot fires established on the north face. Estimated time to structures on Ponderosa Heights, 15 to 20 minutes. Recommend immediate evacuation of any remaining residents." Mark knew that topography. Morrison Ridge was 3/4 of a mile from their property, separated by a steep canyon filled with bone-dry vegetation. 20 minutes meant the fire was moving at over 2 miles per hour. Unheard of speed for a surface fire, possible only when flames crowned through the forest canopy, leaping from treetop to treetop, generating their own weather systems, feeding on superheated air that rose and pulled in more oxygen in a self-perpetuating cycle of destruction. 20 minutes meant they had no time at all. The phone rang. Mark answered with shaking hands. "Morrison, it's Jenkins. Please tell me you're not still at your property." "We're here." A long silence. Then, "Mark, brother, I know you're one of the best fire behavior analysts we've got. I know you understand what's coming. I'm begging you, get your family in a vehicle and drive north right now. Don't pack anything. Don't look back. Just drive." "I can't." "What do you mean you can't?" "Mark, if you stay, I'm sending a crew up there to extract you by force if necessary." "Don't." Mark's voice came out stronger than he expected. "Don't risk your people's lives. We're protected." Another silence, this one shocked. "Protected? Mark, what the hell are you talking about? Have you lost your mind?" "Maybe. Probably." Mark looked out at Caleb, who had finally stood and was walking back toward the house, his face serene despite the apocalypse approaching. "But we're staying. And Jenkins, document what happens here. Document everything." He hung up before the fire chief could respond. At 5:47 p.m., the fire breached their eastern property line. Mark stood on the back deck with a garden hose in his hands. Laughably inadequate, but movement kept him from screaming. Susan had filled every sink, bathtub, and container with water. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, drawing pictures with crayons. A house surrounded by flames, untouched, with a blue-robed figure standing guard at each corner. The sound was like a freight train combined with a jet engine combined with the end of the world. Flames rose 100 feet into the air, incinerating 60-foot pines in seconds. The heat was so intense that Mark's exposed skin felt sunburned despite being a quarter mile from the fire front. Embers the size of dinner plates swirled through the air like demented fireflies. "It's here," Caleb said calmly, not looking up from his drawing. "She says don't be afraid. She says to watch." The fire hit their southern property boundary like a tsunami of flame. A stand of mature ponderosas exploded in sequential detonations as superheated resin vaporized and ignited. Mark watched his neighbor's house, visible through the trees half a mile south, vanish in a pillar of fire so intense it created its own updraft, pulling flaming debris 1,000 feet into the air. The firestorm rolled toward them with mathematical precision. 300 yards, 200, 100. Mark pulled Susan and Caleb close, shielding them with his body, preparing for the end. And then, impossible, inexplicable, undeniable, the fire stopped. Not slowed, not reduced, stopped. At the exact boundary of their property, flames that had been roaring with hellish intensity simply diminished. Embers that should have ignited their roof drifted down cold and harmless. The hurricane-force winds that had been driving the inferno died to gentle breezes the moment they crossed onto Morrison land. Mark stared in disbelief as the fire split around their 12 acres, like a river dividing around a stone. To the north, south, east, and west, destruction reigned absolute. But their property remained an island of green in an ocean of flame. "The meteorology doesn't allow for this," Mark heard himself saying mechanically. "Local wind patterns can't account for this. There's no fire break, no change in fuel type, no explanation." "She is the explanation," Caleb said simply, taking Mark's hand. "She promised, and she keeps her promises." For 6 hours, the creek fire raged around them while they stood untouched. At 11:43 p.m., Mark's phone rang again. "Morrison." Jenkins' voice was shaking. "We've got aerial imagery from the infrared flyover. Mark, I'm looking at something that's not possible. Your property is showing cool, completely cool, while everything around it is glowing white hot. It's like there's a force field around your house. What is happening up there?" "A miracle," Mark whispered. "Tom, what's happening here is a miracle." He could hear the fire chief's breathing, ragged and uncertain. "Command wants to send investigators. After the fire's controlled, they need to understand. They won't understand. I don't understand. But I believe. God help me, I finally believe." When dawn broke on February 8th, the creek fire had consumed 11,847 acres, destroyed 43 homes, and caused $28 million in damage. Firefighters would battle it for another 6 days before achieving full containment. But when the evacuation orders lifted and residents began the heartbreaking journey back to assess their losses, word spread quickly about the impossible house on Ponderosa Heights. The Morrison property stood pristine, grass still green, trees still living, house untouched, while scorched earth stretched in every direction. The contrast was so stark that the first firefighters to see it in daylight stood in silence, unable to speak. By February 10th, news crews had arrived. Helicopters circled overhead. Scientists from Northern Arizona University's School of Forestry came with instruments and sensors, trying to measure soil moisture content, fuel loads, microclimate variations, anything that might explain the unexplainable. Dr. Patricia Reeves, a fire ecologist with 30 years of experience, stood at the property boundary with her jaw clenched in frustration. The fuel types are identical on both sides of this line. The topography is uniform. The weather conditions were universal across this entire slope. There is no scientific mechanism for selective fire behavior at this scale and precision. None. Could it be some kind of underground water source? A graduate student suggested. Something that kept the fuel moisture higher? Dr. Reeves shook her head slowly, staring at the green grass growing right up to the edge of blackened earth. Then explain the trees. Explain why not a single ember caused a spot fire on this property when we documented thousands of embers per square meter falling during the fire's passage. Explain why the Morrison house doesn't even smell like smoke, while houses a mile away are total losses. She turned to Mark, who stood on his porch with Caleb beside him. Mr. Morrison, I need you to be absolutely truthful with me. Did you install some kind of experimental fire suppression system? Some kind of gel or retardant treatment we're not aware of? No, ma'am, Mark said quietly. We had nothing. No sprinklers, no gel, no chemical treatment. We had a 7-year-old boy praying to the Virgin Mary and we had faith. That's all. Dr. Reeves stared at him for a long moment, then turned away without another word. But Mark saw her hand move to touch something at her neck, a cross mostly hidden beneath her collar. The media coverage brought attention Mark had never wanted, but it also brought Claire Dennison. On February 15th, exactly 1 week after the fire, a silver Honda pulled into the Morrison driveway. The woman who emerged wore a gray pantsuit, carried a leather portfolio, and had eyes like a shark circling wounded prey. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison, I'm Claire Dennison, Child Protective Services, Coconino County. I'm here to conduct a welfare check on Caleb Morrison. Mark felt his stomach drop. A welfare check? Why? Claire's smile didn't reach her eyes. We've received reports that your child is being subjected to extreme religious coercion and possible psychological manipulation. Reports that he was kept in a life-threatening situation during the recent fire due to religious delusions. Reports that he's being encouraged to believe in supernatural phenomena rather than receiving appropriate mental health care. Who filed these reports? Susan demanded, stepping forward. That information is confidential, but I'm required by law to investigate any allegation of child endangerment, and Mr. and Mrs. Morrison keeping a 7-year-old child in the path of a wildfire because he believes the Virgin Mary will protect him very definitely qualifies as endangerment. Claire's eyes held something beyond professional concern. They held conviction. The zealous certainty of someone on a crusade. I'd like to speak with Caleb privately, she continued, already moving toward the door. I assume you won't prevent me from doing my job? Mark and Susan exchanged helpless glances. They both knew the power CPS wielded, how a single report could trigger investigations that tore families apart, how the burden of proof fell on parents to demonstrate they weren't harming their children rather than on the state to prove they were. Caleb emerged from the house before they could respond, his medal of Our Lady of the Snows catching the sunlight. He looked at Claire Dennison with an expression far too knowing for 7 years old. You're here to take me away, he said flatly, because you don't believe in her. Claire's expression hardened. Sweetheart, I'm here to make sure you're safe. That's all? No, Caleb said softly. You're here because someone hurt you a long time ago, someone who said they believed in God, and now you think everyone who believes is dangerous, but you're wrong. And she wants you to know she's sorry about what happened to you. The color drained from Claire Dennison's face. For just a moment, her professional mask slipped, and Mark saw raw pain flash across her features, old wounds torn open by a child who shouldn't know they existed. How dare you, she whispered. How dare they put those words in your mouth? She turned to Mark and Susan, and her voice went cold as ice. I'm recommending immediate removal of this child from your home pending a full investigation. I'm filing a petition with juvenile court for emergency custody. You'll be served papers within 48 hours. On what grounds? Mark demanded. Emotional abuse through religious extremism, medical neglect through rejection of psychological intervention, and reckless endangerment of a minor. Take your pick. Claire headed for her car, then paused. That house should have burned, Mr. Morrison. Everyone knows it. And the fact that it didn't just means you got impossibly lucky. But luck runs out. And I won't let you gamble with this boy's life again. She drove away, leaving the Morrison family standing in their driveway, their miracle home suddenly feeling like a prison. That night, Caleb knelt at the shrine, as always. But this time, Mark knelt beside him. "Our Lady," Mark whispered, feeling foolish but desperate. "If you're really there, if you really speak to him, then please, don't let them take our son. Not now. Not after you brought him home to us." Caleb took his hand, squeezing gently. "She says the hard part is just beginning. She says Ms. Dennison needs a miracle too. But first there's going to be a battle. A big one. She says we have to be brave." "I don't know if I can be," Mark admitted. "You already were," Caleb said, smiling. "You stayed in the fire. That was the first miracle. Everything else is just believing it again and again." Above them, stars emerged in a smoke-cleared sky, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the reach of human sight, forces were gathering for a confrontation that would test not just the Morrison family's faith, but the very definitions of truth, evidence, and the limits of what modern courts would accept as proof of the divine. The petition arrived on February 17th, delivered by a process server who wouldn't meet Mark's eyes. 23 pages of legal accusations, each one a knife to the heart. Failure to provide adequate mental health intervention, inducement of religious delusion, willful exposure to life-threatening danger, emotional manipulation through supernatural claims. The hearing was set for March 3rd, just 2 weeks away. 14 days to prove they weren't harming the child who had become their entire world. Mark sat at the kitchen table reading the document for the 5th time, his hands shaking. Susan stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself, staring out at the shrine where Caleb knelt in his usual morning prayers. The sky was overcast, threatening snow, but the boy remained perfectly still, his lips moving in soundless conversation. "We need a lawyer," Mark said finally. "The best child welfare attorney we can find." "With what money?" Susan's voice was hollow. "We depleted our savings for the adoption. The fire destroyed our neighbors' homes. We've been helping them. Mark, we can't afford to fight the state." "Then we'll sell the house. We'll sell everything. I'm not losing him." The phone rang. Mark grabbed it, expecting their caseworker, their attorney, more bad news. Instead, he heard a voice he barely recognized. His sister, Rachel, calling from Phoenix. "Mark, I just saw the news coverage about your house, about Caleb, about what Child Services is trying to do." Rachel paused, and he could hear emotion thick in her throat. "I'm coming up there, and I'm bringing someone with me, someone who can help. Rachel, unless you know a miracle-working attorney who works for free, better. I know Father Miguel Santos. He's a priest, but before he took orders, he was a canon lawyer at the Vatican. He's dealt with cases like this before. Families targeted because of claimed supernatural experiences. Mark, he's been investigating religious phenomena for 20 years. If anyone can help you prove what's happening is real, it's him." Hope flickered in Mark's chest, dangerous and desperate. "When can he come?" "We'll be there by tonight." Father Miguel Santos arrived at 6 p.m. in a battered pickup truck, accompanied by Rachel and carrying a leather satchel that looked older than Mark himself. The priest was in his mid-60s with silver hair, kind eyes, and the weathered hands of someone who'd spent years doing manual labor before entering seminary. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his handshake firm and warm, "your sister tells me you've experienced something extraordinary. But before we discuss that, I need to speak with Caleb. Alone. I hope that's acceptable." Mark hesitated, protective instincts flaring, but something in the priest's gentle demeanor, the lack of skepticism or judgment in his eyes, made him nod. "He's upstairs in his room." Father Santos climbed the stairs slowly, knocked softly on Caleb's door, and disappeared inside. Mark paced the living room while Susan made coffee with shaking hands. Rachel sat quietly, her presence a comfort neither of them had known they needed. An hour passed, then another. Finally, the door opened and Father Santos descended, his expression unreadable. Caleb followed, took one look at Mark and Susan's terrified faces, and ran to them. "It's okay," the boy said, hugging them both. "He believes me. He understands." Father Santos settled into an armchair, pulling a small recording device from his satchel. With your permission, I'd like to record this conversation. It may be useful in court." "What did Caleb tell you?" Susan asked. "Everything. And Mrs. Morrison, I want you to understand something. I have investigated over 40 cases of claimed Marian apparitions in my career. Most turned out to be misunderstandings, psychological phenomena, or occasionally deliberate fraud. But a handful, a very small handful, were genuine. What your son described to me bears the unmistakable characteristics of authentic supernatural communication." Mark's throat tightened. "How can you be sure?" "Several factors. First, the content of the messages. They contain no theological errors, no contradictions with church teaching, no personal aggrandizement of the visionary. Caleb doesn't claim special powers or status. He simply reports what he's told. Second, the fruits. His behavior has improved dramatically since these experiences began, yes? He's more peaceful, more loving, more obedient." Susan nodded, tears spilling over. "Completely transformed. His previous foster parents reported violent outbursts, night terrors, oppositional behavior. We've seen none of that. He's the most gentle soul I've ever known." "Third," Father Santos continued, "the knowledge of hidden things. Caleb told me about your son Daniel in detail, including that Susan sang Amazing Grace during her pregnancy, that you'd chosen the name after Mark's grandfather, that the baby was born with a small birthmark shaped like a cross on his left shoulder. These are things I then verified with you both through your sister, things Caleb had no natural means of knowing." Mark felt the room spinning. "We never mentioned the birthmark to anyone. The hospital barely documented it. How could he?" "Because someone told him. Someone who was there." Father Santos leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I also asked Caleb to describe the figure he sees. He provided details consistent with traditional Marian iconography, but also unique specifics, the particular shade of blue in her mantle, the white roses at her feet, the way light emanates not from around her but from within her. These aren't details from pictures or statues. They're the descriptions of someone who has actually witnessed an apparition." "But why?" Mark's voice broke. "Why Caleb? Why us? I don't presume to know the mind of God," Father Santos said quietly. "But I can tell you this. Authentic apparitions often occur in places of deep suffering, to people who have endured great trials. Caleb lost everything before you found him. You both lost a child. Your home was in the path of destruction. And in that perfect storm of grief and danger, grace broke through. The Virgin Mary appeared not despite your suffering, but perhaps because of it, to heal, to protect, to remind you that you are not abandoned." Rachel spoke for the first time, her voice thick with emotion. "Can this help them in court?" Father Santos was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know. American courts are deeply uncomfortable with religious claims. The separation of church and state creates a legal barrier. Judges can't rule on the validity of religious experiences without appearing to endorse or reject religious belief itself. But we can present evidence of the fire's behavior, expert testimony on the meteorological impossibility of what occurred, psychological evaluations showing Caleb's mental health. We can demonstrate that far from harming this child, your faith has saved him in every way that matters." "And if the judge doesn't believe in miracles?" Mark asked. "Then we pray for one more." Over the next week, Father Santos worked tirelessly. He brought in Dr. Raymond Vickers, the child psychologist, who prepared a comprehensive report documenting Caleb's remarkable psychological health. He contacted Dr. Patricia Reeves, the fire ecologist, and convinced her to testify about the scientific anomalies at the Morrison property. He reached out to neighbors who'd witnessed the fire's impossible behavior, Carlos and Maria Herrera, whose home 300 yards south had burned completely while they watched the Morrison house remain untouched. But he also uncovered something that made Mark's blood run cold. On February 28th, 3 days before the hearing, Father Santos came to the house with a manila folder, his expression troubled. "I've been researching Claire Dennison," he said quietly. "I have contacts in the Phoenix diocese who remember her family. Mark, Susan, I think you need to understand who you're dealing with." He opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings from 15 years prior. The headlines made Mark's stomach turn. Local pastor arrested on child abuse charges. Congregation members describe discipline rituals. Children removed from religious compound. Claire Dennison grew up in what authorities eventually classified as a cult, a fundamentalist group led by her father, Pastor Raymond Dennison. They practiced extreme corporal punishment, claiming it was biblical discipline, food deprivation, hours of forced prayer, isolation. When Claire was 12, a teacher noticed the bruises and scars. The investigation led to criminal charges. Claire and 6 other children were removed from their families. Susan covered her mouth, horrified. Dear God, her father died in prison. Her mother never recanted, never apologized, maintained to her death that they were simply following God's commands. Claire was adopted by a secular family, put through therapy, eventually became a social worker. Father Santos looked up, his eyes sad. Can you imagine what that does to a child? To have the people who were supposed to love you hurt you in God's name. So now she sees abuse everywhere religion exists, Mark said slowly, understanding dawning. She can't separate faith from trauma. Worse, she's on a mission to prevent what happened to her from happening to anyone else. No matter the cost, no matter whether the situations are remotely similar. Father Santos closed the folder. She's not evil, Mark. She's wounded, and wounded people sometimes wound others while trying to heal themselves. Can we use this in court? Rachel asked. Show that she's biased? Possibly, but it's risky. Attack her credibility too hard, and we look like we're victimizing a trauma survivor. The judge may sympathize with her even more. Father Santos rubbed his temples. We need something else, something undeniable. That night, Mark found Caleb at the shrine again, but this time the boy was crying. Deep, wrenching sobs that shook his small frame. Caleb? Mark knelt beside him, alarmed. What's wrong? What happened? She showed me. Caleb gasped between sobs. She showed me Ms. Dennison when she was little, and what they did to her and how scared she was, and how she prayed and prayed, but nobody came to help her. She showed me that Ms. Dennison thinks God doesn't love her because he let those things happen. Mark pulled the boy close, feeling tears on his own face now. I'm so sorry you had to see that. But that's not the sad part, Caleb continued. The sad part is Ms. Dennison is wrong. The lady says she was there the whole time, holding her, crying with her. And she never left. But Ms. Dennison was so hurt she couldn't feel her anymore. And now Ms. Dennison is trying to protect me from something that isn't happening, because she doesn't understand that not everyone who loves God hurts people. Some people who love God just, love. Did Our Lady tell you what's going to happen at the hearing? Caleb pulled back, wiping his eyes. She said it's going to get really bad. She said the judge won't believe at first and it's going to look like we're going to lose. She said Ms. Dennison is going to say terrible things about you and Mom, and it's going to hurt so much you'll want to give up. Mark felt fear grip his chest. But then she's going to show everyone something they can't deny. She said it has to get dark first so the light can be seen clearly. She said that's how miracles work. They come when everything else has failed, so nobody can pretend it was just luck or coincidence. Are you scared? Caleb considered this seriously. A little, but she says even when I'm scared, she's right there. She says she's been there my whole life, even when I was hungry and cold and nobody wanted me. She says she was waiting for the right family, and she brought me here because you needed me and I needed you, and love is the biggest miracle of all, even bigger than fires that stop. Mark held his adopted son, his miracle son, and whispered into the cold night air. Whatever happens in that courtroom, I won't let them take you. I promise. But even as he said it, he wondered if that was a promise he could keep. March 3rd arrived cold and gray. The Coconino County Superior Court building loomed like a fortress as the Morrison family climbed its steps, Father Santos and Rachel flanking them, Caleb walking between his parents with quiet dignity. Inside courtroom 4, Judge Patricia Hammond presided, a woman in her 50s with steel gray hair, reading glasses perched on her nose. and an expression that revealed nothing. Claire Dennison sat at the petitioner's table with the county attorney, Thomas Bradford, a career prosecutor with a reputation for aggressive child protection advocacy. The Morrisons had managed to retain Sarah Chen, a family law attorney from Flagstaff who'd agreed to take the case at reduced rates after hearing their story. She was young, brilliant, and clearly terrified of what they were up against. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, the Honorable Judge Patricia Hammond presiding. The hearing began, and from the very first words out of Thomas Bradford's mouth, Mark knew they were in trouble. "Your Honor, this case represents a clear and present danger to a vulnerable child. The respondents, Mark and Susan Morrison, willfully endangered 7-year-old Caleb Morrison by refusing to evacuate during a catastrophic wildfire, not due to inability, but due to religious delusion. They claim the Virgin Mary promised to protect them. They claim their adopted son communicates with supernatural entities, and rather than seeking appropriate psychiatric care for a clearly traumatized child, they've encouraged these delusions, placing religious ideology above the child's safety and mental health." Bradford pulled up photographs on the courtroom display, aerial shots of the Morrison property surrounded by scorched earth, news footage of the fire, satellite imagery showing the precise boundaries of destruction. The only reason this family survived is blind luck and favorable wind patterns. But luck runs out. And when these parents face the next crisis, will they again choose prayer over action? Will they again gamble with this child's life? The state cannot, will not, wait for tragedy to strike before intervening. Judge Hammond looked over her glasses at the images, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Chen, your response?" Sarah Chen stood, her voice steady, despite her obvious nerves. "Your Honor, my clients made a decision based on information provided by their son, information that proved accurate. The fire did stop at their property line through a combination of factors that scientists are still investigating. Their home was the only structure in a 2-mile radius that survived intact. Rather than reckless endangerment, this demonstrates trust in their child and faith that, whether we understand it or not, resulted in their survival. Faith that could have resulted in their deaths," Bradford shot back. "Your Honor, I'd like to call our first witness, Dr. Ellen Morse, child psychiatrist." Dr. Morse took the stand, a severe woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, credentials that filled 2 pages. She'd never met Caleb, Mark realized with growing dread. This was all theoretical evaluation. "Dr. Morse," Bradford began, "in your professional opinion, what are the psychological effects on a child when parents reinforce delusional thinking?" "Significant and damaging," Dr. Morse replied crisply. "When authority figures validate a child's hallucinations or false beliefs rather than providing reality testing and appropriate intervention, it can lead to persistent psychotic features, inability to distinguish fantasy from reality, and in severe cases, complete break from consensus reality. And if a 7-year-old claims to communicate with religious figures? Classic trauma response combined with possible dissociative disorder. The child creates an imaginary protector to cope with feelings of abandonment and fear. Left untreated, this can develop into more serious psychiatric conditions." "Your Honor," Sarah Chen objected, "Dr. Morse has never evaluated Caleb Morrison. This is speculation." "Sustained," Judge Hammond said. "Dr. Morse, please limit your testimony to general principles unless you have specific knowledge of this child." But the damage was done. Mark could see it in the judge's face, the subtle shift from neutrality to concern. Bradford called Claire Dennison next. The CPS investigator took the stand with the bearing of someone on a righteous crusade. She described her visit to the Morrison home, Caleb's statements, the inappropriate religious coercion she'd observed. "Ms. Dennison," Bradford asked, "in your professional opinion, is Caleb Morrison safe in the Morrison home?" "No. I believe he's being psychologically manipulated through religious extremism. The parents are teaching him that supernatural intervention supersedes practical safety measures. They're prioritizing their religious beliefs over his well-being. And most concerning, They're using his trauma history, his desperate need for belonging, to make him believe he must participate in these delusions to remain part of the family. Susan made a small, wounded sound. Mark gripped her hand. "Your witness," Bradford said, sitting down with a satisfied expression. Sarah Chen approached the stand carefully. "Ms. Dennison, you stated the Morrisons are practicing religious extremism. Can you define what you mean by that term?" "Imposing rigid religious beliefs that supersede the child's safety and well-being." "Are the Morrisons attending a recognized church?" Claire hesitated. "I believe they're Catholic." "So they're part of a mainstream religious tradition practiced by over 1 billion people worldwide. That doesn't mean their specific practices aren't extreme." "Ms. Dennison," Sarah's voice sharpened, "have you personally experienced trauma related to religious abuse?" Bradford jumped up. "Objection. The witness's personal history is irrelevant." "It's relevant to potential bias, Your Honor," Sarah argued. Judge Hammond considered. "I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Ms. Chen." Claire's face had gone pale. "Yes, when I was a child. But that has nothing to do with—" "It has everything to do with it," Sarah pressed gently. "Because you're seeing abuse where none exists. You're projecting your own trauma onto a completely different situation. The Morrisons aren't hurting Caleb. They're loving him, and you can't see the difference because you're still that frightened 12-year-old girl who was hurt by people who claim to act in God's name." "That's not true," Claire whispered, but her eyes were bright with tears. "Your Honor," Sarah turned to the judge, "I'd like to call Dr. Raymond Vickers, the psychologist who actually evaluated Caleb Morrison." Dr. Vickers took the stand and systematically dismantled the state's psychiatric concerns. He presented his evaluation, his test results, his professional conclusion that Caleb was one of the healthiest, most well-adjusted children he'd ever assessed. "But what about his claims of supernatural communication?" Bradford challenged on cross-examination. "I cannot evaluate the truth of supernatural claims," Dr. Vickers said carefully. "That's outside the realm of psychological science. What I can evaluate is whether those claims indicate mental illness. They don't. Caleb shows no signs of psychosis, dissociation, or delusion in the clinical sense. He's simply reporting experiences he believes to be real, which, philosophically speaking, is what we all do." Next came Dr. Patricia Reeves, the fire ecologist, who presented data, graphs, meteorological models, all leading to one conclusion. "What happened at the Morrison property has no scientific explanation I can provide." Carlos Herrera testified about watching the fire consume his home, while the Morrison house stood untouched. Maria Herrera wept as she described Caleb bringing them food and supplies afterward, saying, "The lady told me you would need help." Father Santos provided historical context on Marian apparitions, careful documentation of Caleb's claims, comparison to recognized supernatural events in church history. But Bradford kept hammering the same point. None of this proves divine intervention. Unlikely coincidences happen. And parents who bet their child's life on coincidence are unfit parents. By late afternoon, Mark could feel the case slipping away. Judge Hammond's expression had shifted from skeptical to deeply troubled. Sarah Chen looked exhausted, her arguments growing more desperate. Then Bradford made his closing argument, a passionate speech about protecting children, about prioritizing safety over belief, about the state's obligation to intervene before tragedy struck rather than after. "Your Honor, I'm requesting immediate transfer of custody to state care, with supervised visitation only, pending psychiatric evaluation of both the child and the parents. These people are good-hearted, I don't doubt that. But good intentions don't protect children from harm. The law does, and the law requires us to act." Judge Hammond removed her glasses, rubbing her temples. "Ms. Chen, final argument?" Sarah stood, and Mark could see her hands shaking. "Your Honor, the Morrisons love their son. They've provided him with the first stable, loving home he's ever known. Yes, they made an unconventional decision during the fire, but they survived. Their son is thriving. Their faith has harmed no one and helped everyone. Taking Caleb from this home would be the real trauma, the real harm. I'm begging this court to look at the evidence of love rather than the accident of miracle." Judge Hammond was silent for a long moment. Then, "I'm going to take a 30-minute recess to review the evidence and testimony. We'll reconvene at 4:30 for my ruling." The courtroom emptied. Mark and Susan sat frozen in their seats, holding Caleb between them. The boy had been silent throughout the entire proceeding, his Medal of Our Lady clutched in his hand. "Are they going to take me away?" Caleb asked quietly. Mark opened his mouth to reassure him, but no words came. He didn't know. God help him, he didn't know. Then Caleb smiled, a strange, peaceful smile that didn't match the moment. "It's okay. She just told me what's going to happen. She says in 5 minutes something's going to happen that nobody expected. She says Judge Hammond is about to get the miracle she didn't know she needed." "What do you mean?" Susan whispered. But Caleb just squeezed their hands and waited. Exactly 4 minutes later, there was a commotion in the hallway outside the courtroom. Raised voices, someone crying. The bailiff rushed past their window. Then the courtroom doors burst open, and Judge Patricia Hammond stood there, not in her robes but in her regular clothes, her face ashen, her eyes wide with shock. "I need," she said, her voice shaking, "I need everyone back in the courtroom. Now. Something's happened, something I need to share." They filed back in, confusion rippling through the spectators. Judge Hammond stood at her bench but didn't sit, gripping the wood with white knuckles. 20 minutes ago," she said, her voice barely steady, "I was in my chambers reviewing this case. I'm going to be honest with this court. I was preparing to rule in favor of the state. The evidence, while compelling, didn't outweigh my concerns about child safety. I was doing my job, making the rational decision." She paused, visibly struggling for composure. Then my phone rang. It was Seattle General Hospital. My daughter Rachel, my only child, was in a car accident this morning. Severe. They told me she'd been in surgery for 6 hours, multiple internal injuries, and 45 minutes ago she coded. Her heart stopped. They worked on her for 9 minutes, before calling time of death. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Mark felt the world tilting. But then, Judge Hammond continued, tears streaming down her face now. Something happened. A nurse who'd been working the shift, a young woman named Maria, said she felt compelled to pray one more time over my daughter's body. Just pray. And as she prayed to the Virgin Mary, she's Catholic, she told me this specifically, my daughter's heart started again, on its own. No CPR, no defibrillator, no medical intervention. The doctors can't explain it. They're calling it spontaneous return of circulation, but they're admitting they've never seen anything like it. She looked directly at Caleb, her voice breaking. My daughter is alive. Against every medical probability, against death itself, my daughter is alive. And the nurse who prayed over her? Her name is Maria Santos. She's Father Miguel Santos's niece. She told the hospital staff she'd been praying specifically for this family, for this case, asking the Virgin Mary to show mercy and truth. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hammond banged her gavel weakly, then gave up, letting the chaos wash over her. I don't understand what's happening, she said, her voice barely audible over the noise. I don't understand any of this. But I know one thing with absolute certainty. My daughter should be dead right now, and she's not. And I will not, take a child away from parents who have faith in the same power that just gave my daughter back to me. She looked at Claire Dennison, whose face had gone completely white. Ms. Dennison, I'm denying the petition for removal. I'm dismissing this case. And I'm recommending that CPS close its investigation immediately. These parents aren't harming their child. They're raising him in faith, hope, and love. And frankly, after what I've just experienced, I'm not qualified to judge the validity of their beliefs. Bradford stood, sputtering. Your Honor, with respect, a coincidence in Seattle can't... It's not a coincidence, Judge Hammond said firmly, her voice finding strength. It's not luck, it's not chance. Call it what you will, Mr. Bradford, but something beyond our understanding is at work here, and I'm choosing to trust it." She looked at Caleb once more. "Young man, if you can hear her, if she really speaks to you, please tell the Virgin Mary that Patricia Hammond says thank you. Tell her I'm sorry I doubted, and tell her I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to have even a fraction of the faith you've shown today." Caleb smiled, that radiant, impossible smile. "She already knows, and she says you're welcome, and she says your daughter is going to be okay because you still have important work to do, helping other families stay together." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Hammond nodded slowly, tears falling freely now. "Court is adjourned. The Morrison family is dismissed. Go home, all of you. Go home and hold the people you love." Mark couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what had just happened. Then Susan was crying, and Rachel was crying, and Father Santos was crying, and Caleb was hugging them all, and somehow, impossibly, they'd won. But as they left the courtroom, Mark saw Claire Dennison standing alone by the windows, staring out at the gray sky with an expression of absolute devastation. Not the anger of defeat, but something deeper. The look of someone whose entire worldview had just shattered. And Caleb, being Caleb, walked over to her. "She wants you to know she never abandoned you," the boy said softly. "She was there the whole time crying with you, and she wants you to know it's not too late. It's never too late to come home." Claire Dennison collapsed into the nearest chair, buried her face in her hands, and wept like a broken child finally allowing herself to grieve. Father Santos approached quietly and knelt beside her, saying nothing, just placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. And in that moment, watching a wounded soul finally begin to heal, Mark Morrison understood something profound. Miracles weren't just about fires that stopped or hearts that restarted. Sometimes the greatest miracles were the ones that happened in the secret chambers of the human heart. The moment when pain transformed into peace, when anger softened into forgiveness, when a lifetime of running from God finally turned into running toward Him. The storm had passed, but the greatest miracle was still to come. 3 months after the hearing, on a brilliant morning in early June, Caleb Morrison knelt at the shrine one final time before the move. The Morrison family was leaving Flagstaff, not running away, but answering a call. Mark had been offered a position with the National Park Service developing new wildfire prevention protocols based on anomalous protective factors, the scientific community's careful way of acknowledging what happened without saying the word miracle. Susan had begun training as a foster parent advocate, helping other families navigate the adoption system. And Caleb was simply being Caleb, a joyful 8-year-old who still talked to the Virgin Mary every morning and had started a prayer group at his new school that met under the playground oak tree. But this morning felt different, sacred, like an ending and a beginning woven together. Mark watched from the porch as his son prayed, remembering the terrified man he'd been just months ago, the engineer who'd built walls around his heart, who'd thought faith was for people too weak to accept reality. That man felt like a stranger now. "Is she there?" Mark called softly. Caleb turned, his face luminous. "Always. Do you want to see her?" Mark's heart seized. I can't. I'm not like you. She says you've always been able to see her. You just forgot how." Caleb held out his hand. "Come here, Dad." Mark crossed the yard, knelt beside his son, and for the first time in 5 years he prayed, not the angry, desperate prayers he'd thrown at heaven after Daniel died, but something simpler. "Help me see what's real." The air shimmered, the morning light intensified, and there, impossible, undeniable, more real than anything Mark had ever experienced, stood a figure of such beauty and compassion that his breath caught in his throat. She didn't speak with words, but Mark heard her anyway, felt her message resonate in his bones. "I never left you. Even in your darkest night, I held you. Your son Daniel is safe with me. And this son," she placed her hand on Caleb's head, "I brought to you because love is never lost. It only transforms. Tears streamed down Mark's face as the vision faded. But something remained. A presence, a certainty, a peace that transcended understanding. "I saw her," he whispered. "Susan, Susan, I saw her." His wife came running, and they held each other and Caleb in the morning sun. 3 broken people made whole by grace they'd never deserved but desperately needed. 6 months later, Claire Dennison stood in the lobby of Catholic Charities Phoenix, filing paperwork for her new position, family reunification specialist. Father Santos had helped her find healing through therapy and spiritual direction. The church that had once been a source of pain had become refuge. She'd never forget the day she'd returned to the Morrison house 3 weeks after the hearing to apologize. Caleb had opened the door, smiled, and said, "She told me you were coming. She says you're going to help so many families now." The boy had been right. Already, Claire had prevented 2 unnecessary child removals and facilitated 3 successful reunifications. She was learning to see the difference between faith that harmed and faith that healed. Her phone buzzed, a text from Judge Hammond. "Rachel's 1-year anniversary of her miracle today. Having dinner to celebrate. You should come. We're family now." Claire smiled through tears. Family. She was learning what that word really meant. The miracles continued, though not always in obvious ways. Dr. Patricia Reeves published a groundbreaking paper on unexplained fire behavior anomalies, which led to new research into protective factors beyond current scientific models. She'd started attending Mass again, something she hadn't done since graduate school. Dr. Raymond Vickers incorporated faith perspectives into his therapeutic practice, finding that some patients needed spiritual healing as much as psychological intervention. Carlos and Maria Herrera rebuilt their home and installed a shrine identical to the Morrisons in their new backyard. Their teenage daughter, who'd been on the verge of dropping out of school, graduated with honors and announced plans to enter religious life. And in Seattle, Judge Hammond's daughter Rachel made a full recovery and became a nurse herself, specializing in hospice care, holding the hands of dying patients and whispering prayers she'd learned from Maria Santos. Ripples of grace, spreading outward. On the 1-year anniversary of the fire, the Morrison family returned to Flagstaff for a memorial mass celebrated by Father Santos at St. Pius X Catholic Church. Over 300 people attended: firefighters, neighbors, families Claire Dennison had helped, scientists whose worldviews had expanded, and dozens of people Caleb had prayed for who'd experienced their own smaller miracles. Father Santos blessed a permanent shrine on the Morrison property, now maintained by the new owners who'd purchased the house specifically because of its history. It had become an unofficial pilgrimage site. People came from across the country to pray where fire had stopped, where heaven had touched earth, where a 7-year-old boy had refused to stop believing even when the world told him his faith was foolish. During the Mass, Caleb, now 8 and growing taller every day, was asked to share his testimony. He walked to the microphone, clutching his medal of Our Lady of the Snows, and spoke with the simple clarity that had changed so many lives. "I used to think I was alone. I used to think nobody wanted me and nobody loved me and God forgot about me. But she told me that was never true. She said even when I was most scared and most lonely, she was right there waiting for me to notice. And she said that's true for everybody. Even people who don't believe in her, even people who are angry at God, even people who think they're too broken to be loved. She says she's always there, always waiting, always ready to show us miracles if we just open our eyes." He paused, his young voice steady and sure. "The fire stopping was amazing, but the real miracle was that my mom and dad chose to believe. The real miracle was that Ms. Dennison let herself heal. The real miracle was that Judge Hammond's daughter came back. The real miracle is that love is stronger than fear, and faith is stronger than doubt, and hope is stronger than despair." He looked directly at the congregation, his eyes holding wisdom far beyond his years. "Our Lady of the Snows told me to tell everyone something important. You don't have to see her to know she's real. You don't have to understand miracles to live them. You just have to be willing to trust that even in the darkest fire, even in the coldest winter, even when everything seems impossible, she's there, and she will never ever let you go." The church was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping. Not tears of sadness, but tears of recognition. Every person present had their own fires they'd walked through, their own winters they'd survived. And in Caleb's words, they heard the echo of what their hearts had always known but sometimes forgotten. They were not alone. They had never been alone. As the congregation sang, Ave Maria, Mark Morrison held his wife's hand and his son's hand and felt the presence of another hand, small, invisible, perfect, resting gently on his shoulder. Daniel, he thought, you're still with us. You were always with us. And from somewhere beyond sight, but within his heart, he felt a response. Always. Outside, the June sun blazed over the San Francisco peaks, painting the snow-covered summits in shades of gold and rose. The earth turned. Seasons changed. Fires burned and were extinguished. People died and were born and found each other and lost each other, and somehow, impossibly, loved each other through it all. And over it all, watching with eyes of infinite compassion, a mother stood guard, protecting, guiding, interceding, loving without condition or limit, whispering to every wounded soul the same promise she'd given to a frightened 7-year-old boy in a frozen backyard. You are mine. You are loved. You are home. Subscribe now and share this miracle with someone who needs to hear that they are not alone. Our Lady of the Snows, pray for us.